When a person becomes inwardly awake, the first change is not an urge to explain, but a quiet pressure to withdraw. Words begin to feel imprecise. Familiar conversations lose their grip. There is a subtle hesitation before speech, not born of fear, but of an inner recognition that something newly alive cannot yet survive contact. The impulse to speak weakens. Silence does not feel imposed. It feels necessary. One notices a faint tightening in the chest when asked to describe what has changed, as if the body itself resists translation. What was once easily shared now asks for containment, because the inner movement has not yet found its own boundaries. This silence is often misread as arrogance or secrecy, but it arises from a different source. Early awakening loosens the old agreement between inner experience and outer expression. Meaning no longer arrives preformed for speech. What is seen inwardly does not fit the language of the day. When one attempts to explain too soon, the experience thins, distorts, or collapses into borrowed concepts. The psyche registers this immediately. Fatigue follows unnecessary disclosure. A flatness appears after speaking where there was once vitality. Silence becomes an instinctive correction, a way of protecting something fragile, while it is still forming its own center of gravity. Most inner awakenings do not fail through opposition, but through exposure. This is not conjecture, but observation. When an emerging inner structure is brought prematurely into conversation, it is forced to adapt to misunderstanding before it has consolidated itself. The result is dilution. The individual begins to explain instead of integrate. The experience becomes social property before it becomes psychological fact. Over time, the inner movement weakens, not because it was false, but because it was made to perform before it could stand. The earliest cost of awakening is the loss of easy speech, because speech invites demands the psyche cannot yet meet. Carl Jung encountered this pattern repeatedly, not as an abstraction, but as a recurring psychological law. He noted that when consciousness advances ahead of its social environment, the individual must choose between adaptation and fidelity to the inner process. Silence, in this sense, is not moral restraint, but structural necessity. The psyche under transformation requires a protected interior, much like a body under repair withdraws energy from movement. When this protection is violated, symptoms appear. Sleep grows shallow. Emotional responsiveness dulls. The appetite for conversation disappears, replaced by a need for inward order. What cannot yet be lived cannot yet be spoken. This is not a romantic notion, but a practical one. Inner change proceeds faster than character, and character proceeds faster than social role. When speech outruns embodiment, the individual is divided against himself. One part speaks while another remains unformed. This division produces unease, often felt as a pressure behind the sternum or a vague irritability after social encounters. Silence restores coherence. It allows the inner movement to advance without interruption, without being shaped by expectation, approval, or correction from outside. There is also the matter of misunderstanding, which is not accidental but inevitable. An awakening does not alter others at the same pace it alters the individual. When one speaks from a new inner position, listeners respond from older structures. They hear according to their own needs, fears, and unresolved conflicts. Meaning is bent to fit familiar frameworks. What was precise becomes exaggerated or trivialized. The speaker then feels compelled to clarify, to defend, to refine, and with each attempt the original experience recedes further from its source. Silence interrupts this erosion. Carl Jung understood that silence is often the first ethical act of individuation, not because speech is dangerous in itself, but because premature speech invites possession by collective interpretation. The individual becomes an object of opinion rather than a subject of transformation. This shift is subtle but decisive. One feels it as a withdrawal of inner authority, as if something once anchored begins to float. Silence reestablishes weight. It allows the experience to settle into the body, into habit, into action, where it can no longer be taken away by misunderstanding. As awakening deepens, silence changes character. It is no longer merely protective, it becomes selective. The individual learns, often through error, that not every ear is capable of holding what has emerged. This discernment is learned somatically. The body contracts in certain conversations and relaxes in others. Emotional energy drains when speaking to those who demand explanation, and stabilizes in the presence of those who do not require it. Silence becomes a form of inner economy, preserving energy for integration rather than dispersion. The necessity of withholding is therefore not a strategy, but a consequence. Inner development produces its own conditions. When those conditions are violated, the psyche responds with fatigue, confusion, or retreat. When they are respected, the individual grows quieter, not smaller. Speech returns later, but altered, grounded, and no longer urgent. What is spoken then carries weight, because it no longer seeks confirmation. Until that point, silence remains the natural companion of awakening, guarding what cannot yet defend itself. What is not yet integrated cannot survive exposure. When inner change becomes visible too early, it does not meet understanding but resistance. Others sense the alteration before they comprehend it, and what they cannot comprehend they interpret as threat. The atmosphere shifts. Conversations acquire an edge. Simple remarks are weighed for hidden meaning. The individual feels this immediately as a tightening across the chest, or a sudden fatigue after being seen too clearly. Visibility interrupts the slow stabilization of the psyche, because it exposes the inner movement to forces that were never invited into its formation. To be seen prematurely is to become a screen for projection. Those who encounter a changed consciousness often respond not to what is present, but to what is stirred within themselves. Unresolved conflicts, denied longings, and disowned fears seek an object, and the newly awakened individual provides a convenient surface. Admiration may appear, but it is unstable. Suspicion follows quickly. The individual notices an emotional withdrawal occurring without decision, a natural recoil from the strain of carrying meanings that do not belong to him. What was once inwardly coherent begins to fragment under external interpretation. Carl Jung observed that this stage is often mistaken for strength. The individual believes visibility confirms progress when in fact it tests endurance. The psyche under transformation has not yet developed the structures required to withstand collective reaction. Explanation becomes a defense, and defense drains vitality. One begins to speak in order to correct misunderstanding, and in doing so becomes increasingly entangled in it. The body signals this misalignment through restlessness, shallow breathing, or a dull pressure behind the eyes. These are not signs of error in the awakening, but signs of exposure exceeding capacity. There is a further danger that emerges quietly. When others begin to see the individual through the lens of their projections, the individual may begin to see himself the same way. Identity shifts from lived experience to reflected image. One starts to anticipate reaction, to adjust expression, to manage perception. The inner process slows as attention turns outward. Emotional flatness follows. The original vitality that accompanied awakening recedes, replaced by a sense of obligation to maintain coherence in the eyes of others. This is the beginning of psychic instability, not because the inner content is false, but because it has been externalized too soon. Visibility also invites unconscious sabotage. This rarely appears as direct opposition. More often it takes the form of subtle discouragement, trivialization, or misplaced concern. Others advise caution, balance, or realism, not recognizing that these words carry the weight of their own fear. The awakened individual feels this as a quiet erosion of confidence, a questioning of inner certainty that arises not from reflection, but from repeated interference. Sleep may become interrupted. Appetite for engagement diminishes. The psyche retreats to preserve itself, but now under strain rather than by choice. Carl Jung described this as the cost of becoming psychologically legible before one is psychologically consolidated. When inner change is forced into social recognition, it must conform to existing categories. What does not fit is rejected or reshaped. The individual then faces a dilemma: either simplify the experience to be accepted, or defend it and become isolated. Both outcomes fracture inner stability. The body often chooses first, withdrawing energy, reducing expressiveness, and limiting exposure without conscious decision. This withdrawal is not regression, it is self-regulation. There is also the matter of explanation itself. To explain is to freeze a process into a form that can be understood. When this occurs too early, development arrests at the level of articulation. The individual begins to live inside his explanations rather than inside the experience. One feels this as a narrowing of perception, a loss of depth, a sense that something once expansive has become rigid. Emotional responsiveness dulls. The psyche signals that it has been forced to conclude what was still unfolding. Carl Jung noted that many who falter at this stage mistake the resulting discomfort for failure. In truth, it is the consequence of being seen without sufficient containment. The psyche does not protest loudly, it tightens, withdraws, and reduces output. Social ease diminishes, conversation becomes selective. The individual may feel misunderstood without being able to say why. This is the cost of visibility, outrunning integration. What has emerged inwardly has not yet acquired the density required to exist under observation. To remain unseen during transformation is therefore not avoidance but alignment with psychological law. When visibility exceeds integration, the psyche compensates through contraction. When integration leads visibility, the individual remains intact. This sequence cannot be reversed without cost. Those who respect it stabilize. Those who violate it exhaust themselves attempting to reconcile inner truth with outer demand. The body, as always, records the verdict long before the mind accepts it. Visibility before integration produces instability. Baruch indeed. As inner transformation advances, language begins to fall behind it. Words arrive late, carrying yesterday's structure into today's experience. One notices this gap not intellectually but physically, as a faint pressure when searching for the right phrase, or a dull exhaustion after speaking accurately but too early. The psyche continues moving while speech fixes what should remain fluid. What is named too soon stops unfolding. Silence is no longer merely protective, it becomes a condition for further movement. The individual senses that articulation now carries a cost. Each explanation arrests something that has not finished becoming. This lag between experience and language is unavoidable. Inner reality matures before it can be symbolized. When one attempts to translate it prematurely, the translation replaces the thing itself. Meaning hardens into formulation. The psyche reacts with resistance, felt as irritation, emotional flatness, or a sudden disinterest in conversation. Short statements feel safer than elaboration. Fewer words, more containment. The individual learns that to speak fully is to risk losing access to what is still alive. Development proceeds not by expansion of speech, but by restraint. Carl Jung understood that language is a powerful but dangerous instrument of consciousness. It gives form, but it also fixes. When inner change is forced into words before it has reorganized the personality, it becomes an idea rather than a reality. The individual may sound convincing while becoming internally hollow. This discrepancy produces subtle symptoms: diminished affect, mechanical repetition, a sense of being ahead of oneself. The psyche registers that it has been asked to conclude before it has completed its work. Silence restores the proper sequence. There are experiences that resist translation not because they are mysterious, but because they are structural. They alter perception, value, and orientation simultaneously. Language can describe aspects, but not the totality. When forced, it fragments the experience into manageable parts, each losing relation to the whole. The individual senses this fragmentation as a loss of coherence. What was once unified becomes segmented. Energy disperses. The body responds with fatigue or withdrawal, signaling that too much has been externalized. The temptation to explain arises from uncertainty, not clarity. When something is fully lived, it does not demand articulation. It expresses itself through posture, decision, and restraint. Speech becomes secondary. The psyche recognizes this hierarchy instinctively. When words attempt to lead experience, development slows. When experience leads and words follow at their own pace, integration deepens. Short declarative anchors suffice. Enough. Not yet. This is still forming. These inner statements preserve momentum without fixation. Carl Jung observed that premature articulation often creates a false sense of mastery. One believes one understands because one can explain. But explanation is not integration. Integration alters behavior without announcement. It reorganizes instinct, not vocabulary. When language outruns this reorganization, the individual becomes divided, speaking from a future that has not yet arrived. The body reacts with tension, often localized in the neck or jaw, as if resisting the posture of certainty. Silence allows the body to realign with the psyche. As secrecy deepens, it loses its defensive quality. It becomes generative. The psyche matures in protected darkness, assembling new relations without interference. Language returns later, simpler and heavier, carrying less information but more reality. When speech reemerges from this place, it no longer seeks to persuade or clarify. It states, it rests. Until then, restraint remains essential. Not everything that is known inwardly is meant to be said outwardly, especially while it is still rearranging the foundations of the self. The law governing this phase is exact. Inner development must outrun its description or it will be arrested by it. Those who respect this sequence continue. Those who violate it become trapped in their own formulations. The psyche does not negotiate this order. It enforces it quietly, through loss of vitality, narrowing of perception, and withdrawal from speech. Language must follow life, not lead it. Language that arrives too early stops development. In the final phase of inner transformation, secrecy no longer feels like withholding. It feels like hygiene. The psyche, having learned through strain and error, begins to regulate its own exposure. One speaks less not because there is less to say, but because saying no longer serves development. Attention turns inward without effort. Conversations that once felt necessary now feel excessive. The body confirms this adjustment through steadiness rather than tension. Breath deepens. The chest softens. Silence becomes a stable environment in which the inner structure can complete itself without intrusion. This discretion is often misunderstood as manipulation, yet it contains no strategy. It is a consequence of maturation. When inner authority consolidates, it no longer seeks verification. The need to be recognized dissolves, replaced by a quiet certainty that does not depend on response. The individual senses that not all contact is neutral. Some encounters disturb alignment simply by demanding access. Secrecy functions here as containment, preserving the integrity of what has been assembled. The psyche learns to close its doors without hostility, guided by an internal measure rather than social expectation. Carl Jung regarded this containment as the final requirement of individuation. Without it, inner development remains vulnerable to inflation or dissipation. To reveal too much too soon is to surrender authorship of one's own transformation. Others inevitably reinterpret, correct, or moralize what they do not fully grasp. The individual then expends energy managing reaction instead of living truth. Discretion interrupts this cycle. It allows the psyche to remain sovereign over its own contents, engaging the world selectively and without distortion. At this stage, secrecy is no longer about protection from others, but about fidelity to the inner process. What has been integrated does not need to be displayed. It manifests through action, restraint, and proportion. Speech, when it occurs, is economical and grounded. There is no urgency, no compulsion to convince. The individual feels the difference immediately. Where speech once produced fatigue, it now carries weight. Where silence once felt tense, it now feels neutral. This shift marks the completion of a long interior reordering. Carl Jung emphasized that discretion is not withdrawal from life, but proper participation in it. One no longer confuses openness with honesty, or exposure with authenticity. The psyche recognizes that some contents lose their power when externalized. Others are altered beyond recognition. To keep them inward is not deceit, but responsibility. The body supports this responsibility through calm vigilance. One notices fewer impulsive disclosures, fewer explanations offered unasked. Energy is conserved, presence sharpens. There is also a moral dimension, though it is never announced. By refusing to reveal what others cannot hold, the individual avoids burdening them with material they are not prepared to integrate. This restraint preserves relationship rather than damaging it. Silence becomes an act of respect for both inner truth and outer limitation. The awakened individual learns that discretion maintains balance, while revelation often creates imbalance disguised as intimacy. This understanding arrives without instruction, through lived consequence. Integration completes itself in privacy. The psyche requires a sealed interior in order to establish hierarchy, coherence, and proportion. When this interior is breached, The structure weakens. When it is respected, it stabilizes. The individual feels this stabilization as an increase in gravity. Decisions become slower, but more exact. Emotional reactions diminish in intensity, but increase in clarity. One no longer reacts to misunderstanding, one simply refrains from creating it. Carl Jung observed that those who fail at this stage often mistake openness for courage. They reveal what should remain contained and then suffer confusion, exhaustion, or loss of direction. Those who succeed do not announce success. Their lives become quieter, not smaller. The inner work ceases to require commentary. It has found its place. What remains unspoken does not press for release. It rests fully integrated, requiring no witness. The final law governing spiritual awakening is neither negotiable nor moralistic. It operates regardless of belief or intention. When inner authority has formed, it demands containment as its condition of permanence. Violate this condition, and the structure dissolves. Honor it, and the psyche remains intact under all circumstances. Integration requires containment to endure.